This weekend, while Americans are filling their tanks at $4.51 a gallon and watching Trump post about Iran negotiations on Truth Social, something is happening in Ottawa that almost nobody in Canadian media is discussing clearly. The energy card that Carney spent 3 months building, the card that changed the entire dynamic of the USMCA negotiation, is being taken off the table, not by Trump, by the same war Trump started. And the question Canada now has to answer, with 37 days left before the July 1st deadline, is whether the window was used in time. This is not a Middle East story. This is a Canada story. And it is happening right now. Here's where it gets really interesting. When the United States and Israel launched strikes against Iran on February 28, 2026, the Strait of Hormuz closed. 20% of the world's oil trade went with it. The International Energy Agency called it the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. Brent crude surged from around $70 a barrel to above $115 at its peak. And something happened that no amount of Canadian pipeline diplomacy or trade diversification strategy could have manufactured. The energy dependency that Ottawa had been quietly pointing to for years became the undeniable, front-page, politically impossible to ignore reality that every American refinery operator and Republican strategist in a Midwest swing state had to acknowledge. Canada sold $111 billion worth of oil to the United States in 2024. 60% of all U.S. crude imports come from Canada. The refineries in Toledo, Ohio, and Whiting, Indiana, were modified at a cost of billions of dollars specifically to process Alberta heavy crude. When the Strait closed and Persian Gulf alternatives became inaccessible, none of that infrastructure changed. What changed was that everyone in Washington finally understood what it meant. Carleton University professor Fen Osler-Hampson, co-chair of the expert group on Canada-U.S. relations, told the Canadian press in March that Washington was suddenly looking at Canada slightly differently, no longer solely in tariff terms. That shift did not happen because of anything Carney said or any strategy Ottawa deployed. It happened because Trump's own war made the 60% number impossible to dismiss. Now here is what Carney actually did with that window. Carney did not treat the Iran energy shock as a diplomatic gift to wave at Washington. He treated it as structural validation, evidence that the argument Canada had been making quietly for years was now empirically unavoidable. Minister Dominic LeBlanc, in briefings through April, described the energy relationship as central to how Canada was framing the USMCA conversation. The Globe and Mail reported Canada making the case directly to American negotiators. American refinery infrastructure had been built around Alberta crude, and rewriting that dependency was not a trade policy decision. It was a multi-year, multi-billion-dollar infrastructure rebuild that no July 1st deadline could compress. At the same time, the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion, the project Trudeau refused for years and Carney advanced, was delivering results that made the Canadian position even stronger. For the first time ever, Canada's seaborne crude exports to China surpassed flows to the United States in April, according to commodity analysts KP Lear. Canada was no longer just dependent on the American refinery market. Canada had a Pacific alternative. The pipeline was not just an energy project, it was a negotiating card, and it had arrived at exactly the right moment. Think of what that dependency actually meant in practice during the peak weeks of the Iran shock. When Brent crude was trading above $115 a barrel in March, and American gasoline was approaching $4 a gallon, every Republican congressman from Ohio, Michigan, and Illinois was running calculations about how much higher prices could go before they became an electoral liability. The answer every analyst gave was the same. It depends on Canadian supply remaining stable. If Canadian pipeline flows were disrupted for any reason, political, technical, or retaliatory, the Midwest refinery system had no short-term alternative. The infrastructure had been built for one grade of crude, from one supplier, through one pipeline network. That is not a trade dependency. That is a physical dependency. And physical dependencies do not care about tariff schedules. This is where the conversation fundamentally changes, because this week, that card is being compressed in real time. On Saturday, Trump posted on Truth Social that the Iran deal was largely negotiated. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, speaking in New Delhi on Sunday, described a pretty solid thing on the table regarding Iran's ability to reopen the strait. CNN reported Sunday that a memorandum of understanding was being finalized, with broader nuclear talks to follow within 30 to 60 days. JP Morgan analysts told CNN that if the strait reopens in early June, oil prices could average $97 a barrel through the rest of the year, down from peaks above $115. Gasoline futures have dropped more than 10% in single sessions when ceasefire signals hit the market in April. The same mechanism is running again this Memorial Day weekend as Brent crude falls through $98. Here is the number that translates all of this into a Canadian negotiating reality. Brent crude on Sunday morning stood at $97.94 a barrel, still up by more than a third from before the war. That, more than a third above pre-war levels, is Canada's USMCA leverage expressed as a price. Every barrel of oil above $70 is a dollar of political pressure on Trump to keep the Canadian energy relationship stable. When that premium compresses back towards $70, the pressure compresses with it. The difference between $97 oil and $70 oil is the difference between a White House that fears destabilizing Canadian energy and a White House that has options again. But here is the problem Carney now faces. And this is the part that almost nobody in Canadian media is discussing clearly. When Trump wrote not to rush into a deal Sunday morning, that was not diplomatic caution for Iran's benefit. It was a precision signal aimed at two audiences simultaneously. The first was Tehran, holding out for better terms on uranium enrichment and Hormuz authority. The second was Ottawa, because every day oil prices stay elevated is a day the White House feels the cost of Canadian energy dependency, and a day Trump's political team calculates that pushing Canada too hard at the USMCA table carries domestic consequences. Trump's calendar is visible. The USMCA deadline is July 1st. The midterms are November. Close the Iran deal before July 1st, lower gas prices enough to neutralize the political cost, and arrive at the USMCA table with restored leverage. Canadian energy no longer irreplaceable in the eyes of every Midwest voter. Now here is where this starts affecting Canadians who have been watching the USMCA negotiation from the outside. If you work in steel in Hamilton, or forestry in northern British Columbia, or auto parts in Windsor, the tariffs that have been crushing your sector since 2025 have not gone away. Steel is still at 50%. Lumber is still at 45.6%. The formal USMCA bilateral talks between Canada and the United States have not even been scheduled. The U.S. set a May date with Mexico, but Canada is still waiting. Every week, the Iran premium stays high is a week Trump's political team has less room to push Canada harder at the table. Every week, oil prices fall towards $70 is a week that room reopens. Carney's diversification strategy was real and measurable. RBC economics data showed Canadian exports to non-U.S. economies up 17% year-over-year in the 12 months to January 2026. The Trans-Mountain Pacific route was working. The Canada-Indonesia deal signed earlier this year was a real, if modest, call option on Asian demand. But the structural reality remains. 76% of all Canadian exports still go to the United States. The energy leverage that Iran handed to Ottawa was sector-specific leverage inside a much larger dependency, and it was always temporary. There is a specific fact from the Alberta budget picture that illustrates the double-edged nature of this moment. Alberta had projected a $9.4 billion deficit for the 2026-27 fiscal year before the Iran war began. When oil surged past $70, analysts estimated a windfall of an additional $25 to $30 billion in revenue for every $10 increase above the pre-war level. Alberta's fiscal position improved dramatically, a fact that simultaneously strengthened Carney's negotiating position and created exactly the kind of oil premium whose disappearance would weaken it. The energy card that improved Alberta's books is the same card that is now being closed by a peace deal in the Persian Gulf. Those two realities are connected. They are the same card held at the same moment for different purposes. The honest assessment is this. Carney had a window that ran roughly from early March, when the oil shock made Canadian energy undeniable, to this weekend, when Trump's peace signals began compressing the oil premium. Whether that brief but consequential window was long enough to extract durable tariff relief on steel, aluminum, lumber, and autos before July 1st is the question that will define Carney's first year. The window was real. The Trans Mountain card was real. The 60% dependency argument was always real. What Iran did was make all three of those realities politically impossible to ignore in Washington for approximately 12 weeks. If those 12 weeks produced enough pressure for a July 1st USMCA outcome that meaningfully reduces sectoral tariffs on Canadian workers, then Carney's government used the window the way it should have been used. If July 1st arrives and the steel and lumber tariffs are still in place, then the question becomes whether the card was played at the right moment or whether Ottawa waited too long to make the ask explicit. So here is the question for Canadians watching this unfold. 37 days from now, one of two things will be true. Either the energy leverage of the last 3 months translated into real tariff relief for the workers who have been carrying this trade war on their backs since 2025, or the Iran peace deal closes before the USMCA deadline, oil prices fall towards 70, and Canada arrives at the July 1st table with the same structural arguments it had before the war. True, permanent, and politically invisible again. If you think Carney played the window correctly, or if you think Ottawa left something on the table, leave that below.